Okay, it is 1 minute past the hour of 1, so we should start. Welcome everybody to today's event, which is going to focus on the hot topic of road pricing. Much debated and much discussed and much disagreed. So hopefully we'll reveal some of those issues and questions about what makes it a hot topic. To give you a sense of the nature of the topic, if you don't know, the London Assembly produced a report recently into road pricing and asked some questions around it. They had a call for evidence, which is standard in these kinds of things, and it had more than 3,000 responses from people that are obviously interested in various ways and for various reasons in road pricing. Some of them were in favor of it, mainly experts and organizations, and many were against it, mainly members of the general public. So it's a topic that has been around for a while, since at least the 1960s. Whenever it's raised, it always raises some emotive and commentary. So we're going to get into some of that. We've got a great panel to explore that today. We've got Sylvia Barrett, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the Campaign for Better Transport. We've got Steve Goodin, who's the Director at the RAC Foundation. And we've got Paul Swinney, who's Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. So in a minute, to kick us off, Paul's just going to run through a couple of slides, setting out a bit of the context and the background, and then we'll get into a discussion and explore different aspects of it. And I'll say a little bit more about how we're going to try and structure the conversation to make it manageable over the next 50-odd minutes. As always, the Q&A function is the means by which you share your comments and your questions with us. And as we're going along, I'll take some of them and try to feed them into the conversation. So you can do that at any time, but use the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of the screen. So that's how we're going to work it. So Paul, over to you. Just give us your sort of very brief background into an introduction to the topic, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Paul.
Fabulous. Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everybody. So I've got a couple of slides to act as a bit of a provocation to set up the discussion. So we need to talk about road pricing, is the title of the event, and let me sort of give you some of that context. So first up, why do we talk about road pricing? Well, it's because it's good economics. Now, for those of you seeing this chart, which is a thing of beauty, I'm not about to give an economics lecture. I'm not going to go through this chart, but the purpose of it, it shows us theoretical underpinnings about how charging for road use takes us from a position where road users only pay for the costs that they bear, which are petrol costs, running of the costs of the car, through to actually bearing some of the social costs that they create when they use the road space. So that's principally through congestion. If you've got more cars on the road, that then puts a cost on somebody else. That road users don't pay if they're not paying a charge to use the road explicitly, pollution costs, etc. as well. And this is something that has happened in Singapore in particular, where they've got road user charging towards its purest sense, where it's people being charged to use that road, and that price varies depending on what congestion looks like, and it varies through different times of the day. We have a huge range of different types of policies you can put in place, from ones where literally the price changes on a daily basis throughout the day, and you pay sort of X amount for every mile that you drive, through to perhaps more simple ones like congestion charging that is in place within London. Second reason why road user charging is talked about is because it probably points to good finances to be talking about this sort of thing too. So vehicle excise duty and fuel duty are on the slide because we're shifting away from combustion engines, or the thought is that we'll continue to shift away from combustion engines towards electric engines and perhaps other forms of fuel as well to power private transport. And this report from the House of Commons Transport Committee sets out exactly what the problem is. So under the current system of fuel duty and excise duty, that policy will reduce tax revenues obtained from motoring to zero over the next 20 years. And that creates a huge problem for the Exchequer, in that a lot of money is generated from these two policies as they are currently formulated. And if that money dries up, where's that tax duty going to come from? And what does that then mean in terms of the role that road user charging may or may not play within that? There's clearly a fiscal hole to fill there. Should it be done through road user charging, or should it be done through something else, is the question. But the challenge with this is that, yes, it's good economics. Yes, it's potentially good finances. Is that the third point is that it is terrible politics. And principally, this is because we're moving, or we're asking drivers to moving from a position principally where they're in a position of paying for something which was free in the past. So get in your car, drive along the road, you don't have to pay for it. If somebody all of a sudden says, hang on, you have to pay for that, there's a psychological shift there that then becomes a problem. And then we get headlines like war on the motorist come out when these types of policies are put in place. And we see sort of the political backlash that results from that. So we've got on the left example of the article covering the Manchester congestion charge, which was rejected by referendum in the 2000s, and then has meant that talking about congestion charging or road user charging in Greater Manchester has been something which has been fairly difficult since. And then, of course, front of mind, no doubt for everybody, will be the backlash that Sadiq Khan has got from the expansion of the ULEZ out to the rest of Greater London, and the chopping down of ULEZ cameras and slogans like this in the picture you can see in that article from the Telegraph as well. It just really doesn't stack up good well from a political perspective, even if from an economist perspective, in the lecture theatre, it's a very nice, very good thing, very good policy to be doing. Despite this, we have actually seen a patchwork of policies that have emerged. So we've got the M6 toll, for example. We've got congestion charging and ULEZ, which I've already mentioned in London. We've got one road in Durham that has a congestion charge as well. And we've got a number of clean air zones that have been rolled out across the country, all with different rules attached to them too. So a clean air zone in one city isn't necessarily the same as a clean air zone in another, and the different rules that creates, potentially the confusion that creates too. So we are in a position where we have got quasi policies. They're not sort of pure road user charging policies, but they are charging people for the use of the road space. But it very much is come about principally from a local perspective, and the rules around those vary from place to place. So the question then, and the provocation for this event is, so is it now time to introduce road user charging, which hopefully, Andrew, then sets us up for the discussion that we're about to have.
Lovely. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for that. So to try and make it manageable and to get through some of the issues, we're going to organize the conversation into three parts. So the first part question is road pricing, obviously all related to road pricing. Is it inevitable? And then we're going to think about the part two is it desirable? So is it something that we'd actually want to see happen? And then the third one is if we did want to see it happen, is it feasible? Could we literally do it? Does the technology and the means by which we could introduce it, is it already available, or would we have to do a lot of innovation, et cetera, et cetera? So we're going to start with this inevitability question. I suppose there's two aspects to that. Steve, get you to come in on this. But on the one hand, as Paul said, the revenues associated with motoring are on the decline. And just to give a sort of sense of the scale, this because I've seen you quoted as saying it. Now, that's about £35 billion per year, split between fuel duty and excise duty. And that's scheduled to come down quite dramatically to not very much over the next 15 to 20 years, which raises just a tax revenue question, which will need to be replaced on the assumption that we would want to replace it. So there's inevitably on the money side. And then obviously we've got a variety of different policies in relation to net zero on the one hand, or particularly in urban areas, we've got air quality or congestion, or indeed sort of, removal of the car more generally for other uses. So what's your take on this inevitability question, Steve? Irrespective in some respects as to whether we are believers or non-believers. Steve, what do you think in terms of the inevitability? And then I get Sylvia to come in as well. Steve.
Well, I would be very cautious about using the word inevitable. What I would say is it is quite likely that some form of motoring taxation will be sought by the Treasury to replace the £27 billion of fuel duty. Specifically, there are all sorts of motoring taxes, but by far and away, the most significant is fuel duty. that's the 27, 28 billion pound number the Chancellor's going to focus on.
Yeah.
And about 10 billion of that might well have gone by the early 2030s, depending on how quickly we make the transition to electric motoring. So I think there is a very strong probability that the Chancellor, whoever that might be, come July the 4th, the Chancellor will decide that motoring currently bears part of the tax burden. It should carry on doing that, and a way needs to be found of making it so. But I would also draw a distinction between road pricing, as in the sort of road pricing that my economist friends like to talk about. Infamously, I called it TADPOL, time, distance, place, which is an all-encompassing scheme that operates on all roads at all times and is incredibly clever and incredibly sophisticated, and looks a bit like a real version of that graph that Paul showed us earlier. And the use of a price mechanism to try to influence behaviour, which might be done on a far more localised basis, for example, the London congestion charge. Now, I don't think that's inevitable, and I'm not even convinced that is as likely. I think it is far more likely that we're going to see a cash-strapped treasury saying, motorists used to pay this much, we think they should carry on paying this much, and that's why we're getting them to pay this way. For a whole bunch of reasons, using prices to achieve policy aims is very popular in theory, but as you've observed, Andrew, and as Paul has observed, it doesn't necessarily play well. And over the next 6 weeks, I will be genuinely astonished if anyone canvassing for votes opens their conversation with a member of the voting public with, vote for me, I'm a big fan of road pricing. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. I could be proved wrong, but that's...
Well, that might be a mark of success of today's event, Steve. We never know, right? We might be literally about to change the opening gambit from certain people in certain positions of authority and power. That's a high bar for us to set ourselves, but it's a very good point that you make. Sylvia, come in on this, on the inevitability aspect of it, and then we'll get into the desirability issues and as Steve is, how we might do it and how it might emerge, national versus local, etc. But inevitable.
Thanks, Andrew. If I can just do a quick introduction for those of you who don't know Campaign for Better Transport, we're the National Charity for Sustainable Transport. So the reason why we're interested in road pricing is because of the potential to influence travel behavior. So there are different ways of doing that. Obviously, road pricing is not the only one, but it can play a role in this. And of course, from a taxation perspective, as you said, another sort of quick note is on terminology that can be, so it has been called many different things. Road pricing, my understanding is more the national perspective. Road user charging is more the local perspective. We call it pay as you drive because people understand it more. It's essentially pay per mile. That's also been called in the media, where drivers pay by mile driven for different purposes. And that's the other point I want to make. I think we should be very clear between the difference about the difference between a national scheme for taxation and local schemes for tackling congestion pollution, which is what the ULS congestion charge and clean air zones are. A national scheme solely tackles the taxation issue, it raises revenue to be spent nationally by national government for general taxation. Local schemes are implemented and decided upon by local government as a way to tackle congestion pollution. They mostly, they are localized, specifically city centers, and most likely to be paid on a per day basis. So one sets daily price. In London, this can work on pay per mile, and which is what has been discussed in the mayoral election as well. And in London, that can be a replacement for existing schemes. So you mentioned, Paul, earlier that people sort of see it as additional charges. Nationally, it would not if it replaces fuel duty for all vehicles, and locally in London, it would not be an additional charge if it replaces the existing schemes. In other cities where no current schemes exist, then it would be additional, and that's where it becomes more politically and publicly challenging. So those sorts of distinctions, I think, in terms of the national schemes and the inevitability question, as Steve said, it's very likely that, I mean, the next government would need to consider this, because the Treasury has said publicly, income from vehicle taxation is declining. Our intention is to maintain that as it is. So they will need to come up with a solution for how they will do that. And road pricing pay per drive is the sort of feasible option on the table that the Transport Select Committee and others have recommended. We did a report on the public perception on pay per mile, so I can talk about that later on when we come to this.
Okay, great. I'll bring Paul in a second. Steve, just come back to you on this inevitability, and then we'll get into the desirability and feasibility. I mean, obviously, there's a bunch of policy reasons why doing something like this, as I've said, whether it's net zero, or whether it's air quality, or whether it's modal shift, or whatever it is that you want to kind of think about. Some of them, all of them, kind of broadly pushing in a similar direction. But how significant do you think just this revenue shortfall means that something in the motoring space? And I take your point. How significant do you think then the loss of revenue is going to be in actually something happening, whatever that is? We can determine and we can discuss, but something is going to happen, in a relatively short period of time. Steve?
Well, I guess you can again look at that in two different ways. One would be to say, well, £27 billion, that sounds like quite a lot. It's certainly enough money to make any chancellor who found that had disappeared from their coffers to think, where on earth is that money gone? Actually, if you look at the national finances, it is a big number, but is it so huge that there's an inevitability that the chancellor is going to say, I need that filled right now from those people over there, get to it? That's the sort of fault line that I think we teeter along, that most of us look at that and we may or may not conclude, well, if it was me, I'd want the money back. They're paying it now, so they can carry on paying it. And by the way, then I'd be asking my officials in the Treasury, in the Transport Department, what's the easiest way of getting that? Because what I'm after in the Treasury is a nice, surefire slug of money coming in, least effort from me and most bang for buck, so I can get on with meeting my public spending duties. So I came to the view, I was the roads director in the Transport Department back in the early noughties. I came to the view, working on road pricing then, that the only time it was likely that any kind of pay per mile system would come in would be if it was on the back of a fiscal pressure. Because a fiscal pressure that goes straight to the Chancellor, essentially goes straight to the top of government. If the Chancellor says to the Prime Minister, look, I'm sorry about this, but we've got to do this because we need the money, that's probably going to go through. The Transport Secretary says, it'd be nice to tackle some of these things, and this is a tool we could use, but that tool is a politically difficult one. It's a much harder sell.
Yeah, and I think that, as you say, that introduces quite a different dynamic into a policy-led conversation, because you have this sort of background and this real hard revenue question that you need to resolve. Paul, just give us your thoughts on the inevitability, particularly as it relates to the revenue question and the sharpness that might ultimately bring, and then we'll move on to desirability and see where we are on that.
I think Steve's point there about the fiscal pressure it's a nice policy option. I think it is exactly, I would agree with that, about where we would get to. I guess anything sort of in government seems to be, there has to be, if it's going to happen, that's controversial, has to be backed by the Chancellor or Prime Minister, but this one in particular seems to be one where that would be the case. I think that the politics around this that have come to the boil again in the last year or so, I think, are particularly interesting, because they probably make that inevitability in the short term, at least, less. Certainly, I think it's quite interesting to see how Sadiq Khan has continued through with the policy and continued to back the policy in the way that perhaps some of the metro mayors have then said, oh, actually, we're not going to sort of touch anything around that, because we've seen what impact that has had and the worries around the impact it might have on the ballot box as well. So certainly nothing in the short term, but it is this looming fiscal question, isn't it, about what are you going to do about the black hole? And I guess on the plus side, if we're replacing vehicle excise and fuel duty with something else, that would be the element that softens the blow. So to your point, Sylvia, about some of this isn't necessarily going from 0 to 1. Actually, we've got things in place already. That will be the element about how much the motorist, I think, sees that and understands that it's a replacement for something rather than necessarily an additional charge.
Great. Okay. So we're going to move on to part 2 in a second, which is the desirability, and we'll look at some of the questions, issues around that, and some of the trade-offs and what we hear in terms of the arguments for and against. But before we do that, we've got a poll question that we want to bring up for our audience just on this question. So, you can interpret the question in any way that you want. It's a pretty straightforward one, but it's the same question to you, which is road pricing inevitable? You can make your we don't really care about the reasons for your answer, but we do care about your answer. So pick yes or pick no. We accept all the nuances. But okay, let's see the result. So yes, so by 69 to 31, so 2 to 1, give or take, we're in a yes, it is inevitable, and no, it's not. So inevitability to a degree. Let's move on to desirability. Steve, you kick us off, bring Sylvia in a second. What do we hear on the plus side, and what do we hear typically on the negative side for road pricing when we start to enter into this conversation? And there's going to be lots of them, so we haven't got hours and hours, but just what do we commonly hear as to what are the common arguments in favor of road pricing, notwithstanding because it's a source of income? When we talk about actually it's a desirable thing, we should want it come what may. What are we typically hearing, and then what's the sort of general pushback, Steve?
Well, I guess whether we're talking about the national picture or whether we're talking about something that is more city or conurbation based,
right?
What my economist friends would say is, wouldn't it be nice if you had a pricing tool that you can really use in a fine-tuned way, that you can vary the price you charge at different times of day, you can relate it to different types of vehicle, you can really pinpoint precisely the impact you want to have. And good news, if you get this right, there will be some surplus money to be had. But let's be clear, just like the original London congestion charge, the mayor was very clear at the time, and I think rightly so. I am going to tackle congestion. I am going to tackle it in the following manner. If there is any money left over at the end of the day, I'm going to spend it on transport.
Yeah.
And I think that was absolutely central to the public acceptability of that proposition at the time. So wouldn't it be nice to have that very finely crafted tool at your disposal? And I can see myself at the back of the lecture theatre nodding widely and writing that up on the whiteboard, the clever graph. Where I think the warm front of economic philosophy runs into the cold front of reality is, well, let's use the London congestion charge for a moment here. It's a sledgehammer, right? It's a nice, clear sum of money. It hasn't changed for a while. It's probably not going to change for a while. Politicians find it very hard to put up the price of things once they've set them. A sophisticated tool requires prices that are dynamic, that respond to traffic, that respond to some of the externalities that they seek to capture. Well, we're not very keen on that as consumers. So my biggest worry would be if we thought we would have a sophisticated tool, it would inevitably get blunted through the political process of applying it. And what we probably would end up with in, say, any one of our second or third tier cities would be an entrance fee. And that's what the London congestion charge has turned into, is an entrance fee.
Yeah.
Well, again, there's no harm in having an entrance fee if you're so confident in the economic success of your city. What you really need to do is dissuade people from coming into it in some modes and encourage them in other modes. That's a way of doing it. That's nice and simple. Doing something more sophisticated is very, very hard. And it's not a technological very, very hard. What I always used to worry about was, had we gone down the path of a national road pricing scheme back in 2005-6, who would have been setting those prices? Who would have been setting them real time? How often would we have varied them? And how would the politicians have felt in reality when, as everyone on this call will know, once upon a time, they could say the setting of rail fares is entirely a matter for the board of British Rail. And since privatisation, it seems to be, no, it's much more to do with the Transport Secretary. So it would be with pricing. It would become a live political issue, and our politicians have plenty of live political issues already.
Yeah, no, very good. Sylvia, come in on that, add to what Steve's kind of thinking about the pros and the cons. Obviously, on the pros side, there's a lot around, it allows us to achieve policy objectives, how, broadly defined climate, air quality, anti-congestion, etc. On the flip side, you see quite a bit of stuff around, obviously there's a cost question, but there's also, quite a lot raised around fairness and freedom, and the curtailment of those kinds of things. Just give us a sense as to the desirability question from your perspective.
So beyond the sort of prerogative to raise revenue for taxation purposes, the big benefit that I see for introducing and reforming vehicle taxation is to readjust the pricing signals. And at the moment, the system we have with fuel duty is great for Treasury. It's very easy to collect. It's very clear what you pay, even though to some drivers it's still, it can be seen as unfair in some ways. But it's not good. So the system we have ended with freezing fuel duty for so many years and it being politically unfeasible to sort of reform at the moment. It means that driving has become comparatively much cheaper compared to taking public transport, compared to other sort of greener modes. So what we think we need to be looking at, one of the things that we need to be looking at if we are reforming vehicle taxation is about making sure that the greener forms of transport are cheaper. So if you have that sort of new reform charge, that's one of the things that you can look to do. But there are many sort of ways in which you can implement it, and then what objectives you achieve would also vary because of that. So for example, you can start with electric vehicles, because electric vehicles are the reason why the revenue gap exists. So from the research that we have done, people understand that it's important to remain fiscally responsible. It's important that electric vehicle drivers pay a fair share towards taxation and upkeep of roads. So if you were to implement an additional charge on electric vehicles, then you need to think about balances and still maintaining a balance of pricing benefit for people to transition to electric vehicles. The question then is also, do you implement a paper mile system for other vehicles as well, or do you keep your duty as it is? If you do, then that would become more complicated, replacing a simple system, but it would, it might achieve those sort of objectives, but it will be much more difficult to do. The second question is whether you implement that sort of super smart system that changes how much you pay depending on conditions on the road or depending on sort of vehicle type, or do you keep it flat? But there's also a middle sort of ground where you can pay per mile just based on your vehicle and not on external conditions. So I think there is a way to find a per mile tax that's also simple, but again, that will depend on that will change what you can achieve with it. You could have local top-ups on top of that. So I see there are questions about local revenue. So there is an option to have local schemes attached to the national scheme, if you will, that take into account local congestion and pollution. And you would need to have the revenue agreements between national and central and local government. But that will provide some much needed revenue for local transport investments. And I think that's the sort of main point I'm coming to, if you will, that any new scheme needs to provide those alternatives that many people currently don't have. So investment in public transport would be very, very important if a new scheme was to be introduced.
Okay, that's very helpful, particularly that last point, because that would begin to suggest where you might do it more than you might do it in some places more than other places for reasons of alternative viability, etc. Paul, just come in on this, your kind of reflections on the desirability. I want to come back to this design question in a moment and get some significance as to how much it matters. But Paul, just your general sort of points on the desirability.
Well, as Steve's economist friends would say as well, I think, from an economist perspective, it is very desirable in terms of it's a better form of charging for road use than what the current tools we have in place are. It's basically charging you the marginal cost of using road space, and it's shifting you away from just the private cost that the driver faces through to the social cost, as we would call it, and allows for in principle a better management of demand on roads that are busy. That then raises questions, of course, about which I think where you're going to in the design, about whether this is just an urban thing or is an urban and rural thing. Clearly, demand varies across there, so maybe that accounts for it already. But then there are all sorts of challenges, I think, about putting that in place in an urban area compared to a rural area. So, in principle, yes, desirable. There's the tricky questions, I think, about the uncertainty potentially it creates. So, echoing what the two speakers have said about how much am I going to get charged if I drive, and the uncertainty that brings with it, and the complexity of putting that sort of system in place, both in terms of demand management via a flat fee, but also sort of different types of environment, urban v rural.
Right. Steve, come back in, because sort of design questions of, you raised them and so did Sylvia and Paul. I just want to get your sense as to the magnitude. How important is the design element versus an in principle element, which is, we notice that people have materially different responses to road pricing suggestions if you design it like X or you design it like Y. Obviously, if you design it in a way that they don't pay, I bet they're in favor of it. But let's ignore that for a second if they get the concession, because everybody loves a bit of a concession. But ignoring that, do we think that actually the design flat fee versus pay per mile, dynamic versus static, all of that sort of, does that make a material difference to the way that we might engage, particularly the public, but also our politicians in progressing the road pricing discussion and debate? Steve, what's your view on that?
Well, it does have a material impact. And I would say first up, any proposition like this, again, be it national or local, begs the question, and we're all going to be guilty of this, begs the question, how's this going to affect me? How much am I going to be paying if this is introduced? And if the person proposing it can't answer that question, they are in hot water already. And unfortunately, it is quite a difficult question to answer because it depends on so many things. So you need to have in your mind a fairly well thought through proposition of the price being set by reference to this, which would mean the price will be, say, within these bounds, will be no more than the following, and it would apply in the following manner. Because otherwise you're pitching a concept to people rather than something they can actually get hold of. We all know currently if we go to put petrol in our cars, we're talking about £1.40 a litre.
Yeah.
And filling up the car costs this much. A lot of people would say, I put £10 worth of petrol in and then I drive around for a bit. These are the sorts of numbers that people can engage with, whereas entertaining as it was, Paul's graph, I have tried to engage people in discussion about graphs like that, and I tell you, it is a hard time.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. But just to come back to you again, Steve, because both you and Sylvia, well, three of you mentioned it. Get your thoughts again, Steve, and then Sylvia come in. What do we learn? Well, what do we learn from the congestion charge when it was first introduced in 2003, which, very clear objective, as I understand it, very clear structure. You're going to pay a flat fee this is the amount, this is the time it's going to apply, and that's very straightforward to understand. What do we learn from that experience and the way that the public engaged in it, to the extent that we have information on that? And secondly, more recently, we had the ULEZ expansion into outer London, as it were, although it'd been in inner London for a while. As policymakers, what can we draw lessons from that in terms of simplicity is actually probably better, even if it's, as you said, it's a blunt tool. It's not ideal, it's not dynamic, it's not changing, it's not super variable, but it has the benefits of simplicity. Is that the kind of big message, to the big lesson to learn?
I would definitely say that when it comes to designing something that has to work, simplicity is a very strong. I very strongly encourage anyone to think, what's the simplest way we could go about this? The more complicated the system for pricing, the more things there are to go wrong, simply put. When it comes to explaining a scheme, obviously a simpler thing is easier to explain. I don't think, I look for example, at the charging scheme that's going to be coming into New York next month. That's got different prices at different times of day. It's got quite a range. It's got very high prices for commercial vehicles. I don't think that is inexplicable, but fundamentally, I think there is an issue about what is the purpose of this exercise, and does that feel credible to the people who are going to be affected? And one of the things that I think has been more difficult, again, I pass no judgment on it here, just looking at it as what lessons do we learn? If we look at the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, it is at least, I think, fair to say, contested quite how important that expansion is for the achievement of improved air quality, which is the Mayor's stated aim. And of course, in any scheme, one thing that everyone has to watch out for is if like Ken Livingstone, your objective is tackle congestion, and that's what you're trying to do, and you might raise some money, put that to one side, but there's always going to be a nagging suspicion, actually, this is about raising money, isn't it? And if that's the case, if what you're trying to do is raise money for some purpose, well, it's probably better to be upfront about that and say, as we have about replacing fuel duty, look, we're going to raise some money, but we'd like to do some good along the way, as opposed to, no, this isn't about raising money. And this is very important, because if it's not about raising money and you're very successful, you won't raise any money. If the expanded ULEZ works, everyone will have got rid of their dirty old diesels, and the Mayor for London won't be raising a penny out of it, and will therefore be happy. Well, you'll have to ask the Mayor's chief finance officer whether they're happy.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And it reinforces the point we were talking about right at the beginning, which is, part of the motivation, a significant part, whether we like it or not, is going to be this fiscal revenue question that will need to be resolved. And if you pretend that that's not one of the factors, as you say, people just simply won't believe you with good reason, I think. Sylvia, come in on this question. Particularly, the trade-off between a wonderfully accurate, very, very sophisticated, super dynamic, etc., that no one understands, versus something that's a bit more like a hammer clubbing anything that looks remotely like a nail, but has the virtue of being understandable and it can be communicated. Where are we on a kind of balance? What's the trade-off there?
I think as simple as possible is important, something that people can easily understand. So what our reports in September 2022 showed was that people buy into the idea of sort of vehicle tax reform. Half of people supported pay-per-mile as opposed to 18% who didn't. People understood the need for it. People understood that why it needs to be implemented. One concern was about the availability of alternatives, and again, that's the reason why it needs to be accompanied by investments in alternatives in public transport. And I think that's the lesson that we can take away from local schemes that have been successful as well. So in London, there has been significant investment in public transport, both when the congestion charge was introduced with the ULEZ expansion as well. There has been significant investment in outer London to compensate for any people that might be unduly affected. So I think the same applies for a national scheme as well. As long as the Chancellor is very clear about what the benefit of paying that money for drivers is, I think revenue needs to be linked at least to an extent to investment in road infrastructure, investment in public transport, so that people can see what their money is purchasing as well. And yeah, just in terms of benefits, I think politically, I can understand why it might be tricky, especially with Labour's tax commitments. But if the Treasury has already sort of said, well, we will need to raise that revenue, then I feel that that should be it doesn't have to be a difficult proposition to explain and for people to get on board. I think it has been unhelpful, the sort of politicizing of local schemes. So, for example, with the ULEX expansion, we had national government express a view on that. I feel we need to keep local schemes, national schemes separate, even though they can be sort of integrated in future, but they're completely different propositions that need to be framed in different ways.
Okay, that's very helpful. Paul, just come in on the desirability aspect, and then we're going to ask the audience to on the desirability as well, and then we'll move on to this sort of. Particularly, I want to get your sense as to the likelihood of how do we move if we were moving forward? Is it a patchwork of local schemes? Is that advantageous for a bunch of reasons versus a kind of national scheme, or do you see both? So we'll come on to that in a second. But Paul, just anything you want to say on the desirability question and the structure question?
Just on the complexity, I think that's where the politics come in, sort of clash a little bit with this as well. And the ULEZ expansion is interesting in this, and that the ULEZ expansion actually was pretty simple, and that it was, for all the polluting cars, very small share of overall cars that actually that have to pay that, and yet that wasn't something that was grasped by people in the areas where the expansion was happening seemingly. Now, I think there was a political mischievousness going on there in order to perhaps mislead, because it helped at the ballot box. But it seemed as if there was a general discussion around how this was going to affect all drivers, and it wasn't. It was only a small share. So I think there's something there even about, it's not just about is the scheme simple, but how is the scheme communicated to? And that's probably where I think the mayor probably could have been a little bit strong. Perhaps he looks back on that and reflects on that as well, that the communication is really important within this, because it is a highly politicized area, and you immediately get words like cash cow coming out and war on motorists coming out as well. Yeah.
Political mischief is a constant in this as in many other things. Okay, let's have the second question on the poll. So we asked you if it was inevitable. So that's really, no matter whether you think it's a good thing or not, it's just whether you think it's going to happen for whatever reason. Now it's a bit more of a desirable. So we begin to see your expressions of whether you think it's a good thing or not. Is road pricing desirable? Lots of nuance, etc., which you've heard from Stephen, Sylvia, and Paul. Let's get the answer. Is it desirable? Yes, it is. Look at that. We're talking to the converted, or not even the converted, they're convinced. 92% saying it is desirable. Okay, let's move on to the third bit, which is a little bit around feasibility, likelihood, or not feasibility. Steve, you start us off. So we've got a patchwork already. We've got some in London. We've got a little bit in different places. Durham, one street. Oxford, I think, is one street. Central Birmingham's now got a clean air zone. They're all road pricing in various means. In terms of thinking about how this evolves and moves forward, do you see this as, is that the optimal way for it to go? Is that the likely way that it goes, a kind of patchwork out from local areas? Or do you think actually there is a greater likelihood and more value in actually imposing a national system? Steve, what's your thought on that?
I think that the likelihood is that we would have some form of pay per distance that replaces fuel duty, that will be a national tax. I think that, and I'm 100% with Sylvia on this, I think that there are ways of introducing that are less complicated and allow you to ease your way in. It probably means that you do exactly what's happened in places like New Zealand, Iceland. I know they're not comparable countries to ours, but in concept, which is to start with the cars that don't burn fossil fuels, and then apply a distance charge to them. And there's a very easy way of checking the distance. It is to read the odometer. No system is foolproof. No system is 100% cheat-proof. Yes, there will be an industry of people out there saying they can fix your odometer and do terrible things. But for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, probably not a big issue. That's probably a very basic way of doing it. Once you have a basic proposition, it's possible to have more sophisticated alternatives. And one of the things that we've been toying with on and off for many years now is things like telematic-based insurance policies.
Yes.
But basically, if the government said, you have to pay per mile, if you have no other way of paying us, we simply want you to pay upfront this much. This is the way they do it in New Zealand. You give us this much money, which covers you for that many miles. Once you've used up your credit, you have to buy another lot. That's one way of doing it. Alternatively, if you have the capability of paying for the miles you're actually driving, well, that's fine too. And we might find that it's possible to develop a service provider market, for example, with people who are subscribed to sat-nav companies, or who are increasingly buying their cars on a package basis, where the auto company isn't just saying, here's a tin box, we'll see you in 2 years' time, but are actually saying, no, we'll carry on dealing with this for you. We'll deal with the servicing, we'll deal with some other taxes and things for you. And I could well imagine them saying, and we'll deal with this pay-as-you-go tax as well. I think that could be part of the bundle. Where I think it's more difficult is those more specific local charges. And I'm particularly thinking here not about carbon, which is a problem wherever we emit it. I'm thinking about air quality, and I'm thinking about congestion, which is much more about how is it to get in and out of, say, Bristol or Nottingham, as opposed to something that could sensibly be decided in Whitehall.
Yeah. Would you see those two things working together, Steve, or would you add, crudely, would you add a weight into the national system which says, the price per mile or the distance traveled is X plus 5 if you're going into a poor air quality area, and the system can calibrate that? Or would you say it's a flat fee and Nottingham or Bristol can add an extra 10 pence on, or whatever it might be?
I wouldn't rule out something more sophisticated over time.
Yeah.
What I would say is, if what you're saying to drivers is you have to pay a penny a mile, and I'm going to check how many miles you drove by looking at your odometer, that's really easy. As soon as I need to know, I'm speaking as the tax authority here. Now I need to know whether you're driving into Nottingham. And one of the problems we had with thinking of an all-encompassing scheme is it's hard enough to know whether you've been to Nottingham. It's even harder to know which roads in Nottingham you drove around on. I picked Nottingham at random. Could be
That's a good example.
But so the more the tax authority has to know, the more complicated the system is.
That's a very good point.
And if we're thinking about a step one, if we're thinking about something that a Rachel Reeves or a Jeremy Hunt might say in a year's time, I think they'd be far more attracted to something that's nice and straightforward. This many pence per mile, that's what it's going to be.
Very good. Very good. Sylvia, come in on that. Add particularly, pick up on some of how do you think it moves forward in terms of the national vis-a-vis the local? Where do you think we're going to go?
I completely agree with what Steve has said. Basically, I think the Iceland model is the way to go, with a simple per mile charge, starting with electric vehicles, potentially moving towards other vehicles as well. And you can vary the sort of rate depending on the vehicle emissions, for example, but it's a set rate for that vehicle. What you could do with national schemes is you could have sort of top-ups that apply on top of that can be charged basically. But effectively, you can have what we currently have with a national scheme sort of, well, not currently, potentially could have with odometer checks for national taxation, but with camera sort of top-ups for specific city centres charged separately by the city authority, but through the same system, if you will. So if you have the technological app or sort of charging mechanism that applies to a national scheme, any local charges can be calculated and costed and paid through the same system, but apply in the same way as they currently do. Potentially, you could move to the sort of more the tracking option, which is also technically feasible. There's nothing stopping it, but I think you would need to look at privacy concerns that people have. You would need to introduce opt-outs. You would need to introduce potential sort of tax-free allowances for different people. So there's lots of different incremental stages you can go through. But I think at the start, local schemes need to remain separate, with the national scheme sort of being as simple as possible.
Okay, Paul, your thoughts on the local and the national?
Yeah, we've talked about how sort of the economics and finance element clash against the politics. This is probably an area where potentially the economics and finance approaches clash against each other. And sort of going back to Steve's point about what is the purpose of the policy that we're bringing in. So from a finance perspective, there's a hole to fill that would lead towards a national scheme that would be generating that revenue for people using the roads, and that money used either to fill the hole more generally or towards transport more specifically. But the economics element of it is much more on the policy side, about being about demand management and about how we manage the use of road space within urban areas, I think, in particular. And that is something different. So it is, and pollution is so managing road space and pollution issues as well. And that's much more about how does the city function? How do we try and make the best use of space, which isn't about, it's just about raising revenue. And so then you get the position of, well, do you then have a sort of blended scheme where actually there is a national scheme which is purely about raising revenue, but you do have to have these separate schemes in different places to then allow that city to be managed better, or the road space in that city to be managed better. But then you do get the elements of complexity in there, and clearly that then raises all sorts of questions as a result of that. Now, I think the mayors would have something quite interesting to say around this, because you now have schemes in place that are able to raise some revenue, and particularly around clean air zones, as Steve was saying. In principle, that revenue should go down to zero as we get 100% compliance. But I wonder how they would feel about having that national system in place, because if they then felt all of a sudden that their potential levers were taken away from them because this was all national, perhaps they would feel uncomfortable about that. Having said that, they feel uncomfortable about bringing a lot of these levers forward in the first place. So it might be like, yes, in principle, the lever's there from the pull and it gets taken away, but they're not willing to pull it in practice. So perhaps it's all moot in the end.
Yeah, it's a good point. It will interested to get your thoughts on this, Steve, because my sort of reading on that, if I'm the mayor of Greater Manchester and I know or feel reasonably confident that a national system is coming, my incentive, I think, is to introduce a local system ASAP, right, in order to get some of the revenues and the benefits and retain them locally. Because what will happen with a national system is, for certain, there's those revenues, as we've already discussed, will go back to the Exchequer and they won't go into Greater Manchester. And whatever you think about what's going on in London and the reasons why it's done, the revenue, whatever the revenue that is generated in London, whether it's £1 or £100 or £1 million, is kept in London and is then recirculated into London things, whatever that might be: better buses, better transport, more police, whatever you want to determine it. So I don't know what you think about whether political incentives in the short run now is to encourage difficult political decisions, but you use the threat of a national system down the line to make some progress at the local level, and whether we might see some boldness from some of our mayors. I don't know what you think about that, Steve.
Well, I'm going to put what you just said back to you here. I think the national government is going to impose a widely unpopular tax measure. So why don't I get in ahead of them and impose one just on my own constituents?
Yeah, well, that's true.
I'm struggling to see how Andy Burnham is going to see that as a compellingly attractive argument, but perhaps I'm missing something.
That is fair. That's what happens when you have a thought in the real moment and share it, which I try not to do that often, because it's quite blatantly going to. Yeah, that's a fair point. Sylvia, come in on this. I mean, where do we think we're going to be?
Yeah, as I said at the start, implementing a national scheme where nothing sort of currently exists, where it's an additional charge, it will always be more difficult. And that is what our polling showed as well, people support a national scheme for taxation purposes to make sure that all drivers pay their fair share of national taxation and road upkeep and so on, but they're less supportive of local schemes where it's an additional charge. In London, there's the highest level of support for local schemes because paper mile would be a replacement of very blunt daily charges that currently exist, with a potentially fairer option where if you drive less, you pay less. And that's why I think it's a shame that paper mile in London has been ruled out by Sadiq Khan, pushed obviously with the political pressure, because it would have been a much sort of better system for many people, and it would tackle some of the issues that people have campaigned against in terms of the ULS. But I think in any other location, it would be much more difficult, and it has to, but there's still a valuable tool of the sort of overall box for local transport. I think when it comes to promoting modal shift, you need to be investing in the alternatives, but you need to also provide some policies that make drivers think about the way they drive and what journeys they could and they need to drive for.
Yeah.
So I think local charges, parking charges are another tool.
Yeah.
I mean, there's many sort of different options there. And when it comes to raising revenue for investment in public transport, for example, there are again different options. There's council tax precepts, there's many tools, all with their different pros and cons, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. So Steve, start us off final round. Just go back to where we started, I suppose. You know, in thinking about making progress on this issue, what's your thought on sort of the weighting to be given and how we should make the arguments and the weight between, you know, the revenue problem sort of angle and the policy problem angle, or the policy outcome angle, however you define that policy, whether it's better air quality, lower levels of congestion, less carbon emissions, climate, etc. How do we think about the balance we get between the revenue and the policy? How do we, you know, if we want to make progress on this issue, because we've talked about it for some time and we want, you know, we do want to make progress. Steve, what's your thought on that?
My thought is that I learned a couple of things when I worked on this 20 years ago, and I think they're still relevant today. One is if we try to brigade our thinking on raising money for public spending with doing so in a way that has a separate policy outcome, we have just multiplied the complexity of what we're trying to do, and we've made it a lot more difficult to explain. I went to a lot of events in 2004 to 2008. The question I was always asked was, is road pricing about raising money, or is it about tackling congestion? And if I said, well, it's about both, I was met with incredulity.
Yeah.
So that's difficult. I think that the other thing I learned is that economists, by and large, think there's barely a problem on earth that can't be solved through pricing. And that's what distinguishes economists from the rest of us.
Very good. Paul, as an economist, don't defend the whole economics profession because you haven't got the time, but just give us your thought on the balance between, you know, the revenue issue and question and the policy question. Or moving forward.
It feels like the revenue question will probably win out because that is the most pressing, and it goes again back to what Steve was saying earlier about policy v fiscal challenges. It'll be I think what will be interesting to see is that if a national scheme is brought in, what response we do see at the local level, and do we see this separate element of or it being seen in two separate silos almost, or parts, better word, of part of it is about, you know, raising money to pay for the road network and another more general sort of public finance or public taxation. Then there is a second element, which is demand element, which is applied very much to the largest urban areas in particular. I guess that would be something that you'd be looking for the mayors to take leadership on. And it'll be interesting to see whether they would actually feel comfortable about doing that, and whether they felt it was practical to do that with the political cover, I guess, for want of a better phrase, of having a national scheme in place.
Yeah, very good. Sylvia, we're up against it, but give me your final thought.
Thank you. Very quickly, I agree. Revenue replacement should be the driving sort of factor in this, and it should be the factor by which you explain it to the general public. And something I should have said at the start is that it very much depends on how you engage and how you explain the need for this to people. And that's something that our polling showed, that support increased the more people understood what the scheme is about, and what mitigations you can have in it. So we chair a forum, a quarterly forum of 35 organizations that are interested in this, and we're looking to sort of convene and demonstrate the different perspectives and also the points of agreement. So I think it's important that the Treasury sort of takes these things on board and consults in due time.
Very good. A very good point to finish on. It's 1 minute past the hour of 2. Thank you very much to my panel, Sylvia, Steve, and Paul. It's been really helpful. Hopefully, undoubtedly, within the next few days, if not hours, Steve, we'll hear road pricing being discussed by the very people who want to be in power. We'll know that that we've had some impact. But until then,